Yeah, great to see everyone this afternoon on our weekly partner webinar. So today we're with KingsBridge again, our insurance partner for Recruitment FDs. And we're here to talk about a specific topic in fully contracted out services. This is a innovation that's becoming increasingly popular with recruitment companies. And a number of our members have had this as a key part of their growth strategy this year. So it's an interesting innovation, but it's really crucial that you're aware of the risks and you're protecting your business adequately. So we've got Stuart Hayne and Ryan Dawson from KingsBridge here today to talk through this type of engagement and what you need to do to protect your business from an IR35 perspective. We'll keep it to under half an hour, probably 15-20 minute presentation and a Q&A. So over to you guys.
Perfect. So yeah, like I say, so my name's Ryan. I've been at KingsBridge for the last 6.5 years-ish. My role at KingsBridge is predominantly everything in regards to things like employment status, IR35, and pretty much everything consultancy facing as well. So hopefully there's, what we'll go through today will be useful. Like Keith says, we're seeing a sort of trend in terms of the market shifting towards, in some cases, a fully contracted out service. So what we'll do is we'll cover off between both myself and Stu, and I'll let Stu introduce himself in a moment, but we'll cover off what a fully contracted out service is, give you kind of a brief overview of kind of what it looks like, the features of one, the pros and cons of one in that same sense, and kind of some of the market trends that we're seeing and people using them, and potentially the kind of underlying reason why they're actually using it. We'll then cover off some of the IR35 considerations, which are pretty important, and we'll get to that, as well as kind of how we at KingsBridge can potentially support your organisation or your business if it's something that you're considering. So I'll let Stu introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm Stuart. So I head up the business development team here at KingsBridge. In terms of from a fully contracted out service perspective, we work in the main, obviously, with recruitment agencies and clients, and have been kind of an integral part of implementation and support during that. As Ryan alluded, from an IR35 perspective and kind of consultancy, that's definitely much more Ryan's bag. But in terms of from a partnership perspective and how we support agencies, we're much more kind of front customer facing and making sure we're there to support. So happy to give some kind of like real life examples of how we've engaged with businesses and some common trends. So I won't be probably as quite frequently involved as Ryan, but more than happy to help where I can.
Perfect, thank you, Stu. So what is a contracted out service then, or a fully contracted out service? So again, we'll cover off the differences and what we're talking about here, but to set the scene, a fully contracted out service is commonly known as a type of business model with which a service provider, so that's the first bit of terminology we'll refer to, a service provider will deliver an outcome or deliverable or maybe a managed service for a customer. Now, the problem with fully contracted out services really across the industry is, as I've got on the screen there, there doesn't appear to be a single universal name that is used by everybody. Fully contracted out service is what HMRC would refer to it as. However, whether you're a recruiter, a consultant, a customer, they all come in a different name. So contracted out service is what we see most, but you'll often see statement of works, managed service provider, etc. It can be called anything, but the real key is the actual thing that it is, and we'll cover that on the next slide. Now, I guess in that same breath, that there isn't much guidance in terms of what a fully contracted out service is, which, when kind of talking in this sense around employment status and who's responsible for dealing with employment status, etc., isn't entirely helpful. But there is one piece of guidance which HMRC do have, which is reasonably good, or at least it's a reasonable starting point, and that's within the employment status manual. So the reference within that point is 10010. Don't go and read the entire manual for the sake of checking for contracted out services guidance, but that reference, if you just simply Google that reference, you'll find that page, and it does highlight kind of HMRC's view as to what a contracted out service looks like. Now, their examples are idealistic. They try and paint this picture of it being black and white, and unfortunately the reality is that there's really no circumstance in contracted out services which are necessarily black and white. But HMRC's view is that to to check whether something is a genuinely contracted out service or a fully contracted out service. It's a question of fact, and it's based upon the commercial reality of the arrangements. And some of the things that obviously go into that that kind of overall picture as to saying whether something's contracted out is the nature of the business itself. So, you know, what's the service that's actually being provided? The nature of the service provider's contract. So, you know, what's the formation of that contract? How are you paid? What's the deliverables? How is payment marked against the actual piece of deliverable itself? And what's the relationship between the worker, the service provider, and the end client or customer? So these are all things that HMRC highlight as being key to kind of looking at whether something's a contracted out service. Now, beyond that, in terms of HMRC's guidance, you would typically look at the courts and you'd say, well, what guidance have we got from case law that would tell us one way or the other what is what? And the reality is there isn't really any. So there is no case that I'm aware of, at least, that kind of, you know, points in the direction of saying this is what it is. But there are some cases which give you a bit of guidance as to what it is. So nothing necessarily binding, but guidance as to what a contracted out service might be, and that comes from a case called Tilbury. Again, no need to go and read that, you know, it's not really necessary to do so, but the principles that come out of it are really important. So on the left hand side of the screen, what we've got is a list of things that are typically present within a normal recruitment agency's kind of working day in terms of placing a worker and how that worker then operates with the end customer. And then on the right, you've got a contracted out service, and the features of the two are very different. So where you're placing basically the labor, so the sort of personal service of a contractor, typically the client would contract for workers, named or not, so it's the provision of workers. The client would manage the projects that those workers are operating on, and the contractor would generally work as part of a team that's managed by the end client. The contractor would normally work on client's premises, albeit this case is from 2003, and since then technology and everything else has changed. So that's not necessarily something that's as present today. Usually with most products now, contractors probably quite freely work on and off site. Contractors would typically report to the client, so it'd be them that they're actually reporting into and actually discussing things with about the project itself. The agency would have kind of a hands-off relationship until it sort of came to being paid, I'd imagine. And the client ultimately is responsible for the deliverable itself. They're the ones who are responsible for the project that they've got those contractors working on. And really, really crucially, the actual sort of price or the cost of that worker is going to usually, in most cases, be based on time and actual materials. So, you know, what effort the contractor's putting into that project is likely what they're paid to get out of it. Now, when you look at a contracted out service, now that's very different. So the nature of that service in itself becomes very, very different. So the client would contract for a task, deliverable, or project, so a kind of tangible thing. So rather than me maybe going to someone like Stu and saying, hey, you know, I need 10 workers to come and build some JavaScript, for example, I might say, hey, you know, build me an IT software. Here's £500,000. I want it done in 6 months. You know, that's what we're talking about. In terms of a contracted out service, really, that's the ideal. Now, what you then have is a contracted out service provider, or the service provider, and that service provider should be the one that would manage the project and indeed the team of workers behind it. And those teams could be in a few different formats. They could be a mixture of contractors, perm employees, self-employed, agency workers, you name it. To the end customer, it shouldn't really matter, but the service provider is the one that's ultimately managing all of those. Typically in a contracted out service, the contractor would work on the service provider's premises and where possible. And if they visit the end client or the end customer's site, it would only be to conduct work which would be necessary for it to actually do. So, for example, if there was integration of software and they had to be on site to integrate that software with the existing kit that's there, for example. A crucial point here as well is the integration that the contractor has between the service provider and the end customer. So typically speaking, in a contracted out service, the contractor or the worker would report into the service provider, and there'd be a clear line between service provider and end customer. And more or less in most contracted out services, the fee that service provider actually gets will be based on the actual piece of project that it's delivering, not just the markup on the contractor's rate per day or per week, for example. So those are the features really of kind of the two models and how they're different. I hope that paints a bit of a overall picture as to what one is and how it works, before then covering some of the market trends that we're seeing about how they're being utilized. So I think the starting point for this then is looking at how have they really evolved since IR35 reforms. And one thing that we're definitely seeing is a massive increase in the use of contracted out services, or businesses setting out to provide a contracted out service as a result of the IR35 reforms. So you have to ask the question, is it being driven by IR35 reforms, or is it a genuine opportunity to profit because the margins can be far greater in terms of the actual chargeable work, the ability to profit on that work. So we've seen a lot of recruiters shift to contracted out services, or offering them perhaps next to or in conjunction with their typical recruitment model, to retain clients that they're working with. So some good examples out there are potentially things like the banks, and also things like scientific studies. Those types of end clients typically knocked contractors on the head entirely when the reforms came around, but they've just simply re-engaged with many of those workers via a contracted out service. Now, whether that's genuine or not, that will soon kind of rear its head, I'd imagine, and we can cover more on that in a moment. But the point here is quite a lot of these providers have done so to try and keep working with clients that they maybe would have lost because they weren't accepting limited company contractors anymore. Some businesses in doing that have created entirely new entities, so perhaps started a completely new business. And we've got dozens of clients that have sort of come to us, and we've helped kind of guide them in the right direction in sort of doing that. Again, it's a completely separate offering to the recruitment model. So some businesses have said, well, here we'll completely start a new entity to actually deliver that. Contractors themselves as well, in some cases, have moved to actually providing a contracted out service. So again, they've sort of moved from providing their personal service to clients directly, and instead changing it to a more deliverable focused outcome. And we'll cover off on the next slide kind of why that is and what that looks like and why they're doing it. Something to be really, really aware of is that HMRC themselves are aware that contracted out services are being abused in some cases to navigate IR35. This isn't just us kind of sort of finger in the air guessing at that point. In some of the work that we're doing in actually defending end clients against HMRC at the moment with regards to the off-payroll working rules, HMRC are very, very curious around how businesses engage with contracted out services. So it's the first time that we've really seen any activity from HMRC, either standalone or with ongoing investigations, that would really poke and prod the beast, shall we say, around what a contracted out service looks like, and in particular the actual sort of piece of due diligence that's being carried out by the parties involved to ensure that it's genuine. So what you've got to really ask here is, is the change or is the motivation to having a contracted out service genuine? What's the actual intention of doing it? I think we see, and I'll let Stu cover off in a moment as well if he wants to, but what we see quite a lot of is businesses that will say things like, our end clients engaging contractors with a competitor of ours, how are they doing it? And it's typically really via a sort of contracted out service, and some businesses try to move to a contracted out service to keep up with competitors, for example. Nothing wrong with doing it, but it's important that you get that right, and we'll cover off in a moment just sort of what that is, because it will have a big implication on the IR35 impact, which again we'll cover off kind of what that impact might be. So IR35 considerations then. So when you have a contracted out service, the receiver of that service does not need to consider IR35 or the off-payroll working rules. So the kind of concept here is a genuine statement of work is not the supply of an individual or individual's skill. So you are not providing the personal service of a contractor to an end client. You're providing an outcome deliverable or a product. So in theory, a contracted out service, if it's genuine, should fall outside the scope of IR35 altogether, because there is a contract between a supplier and a service receiver for a deliverable or a product rather than a person and their skill. So from an IR35 perspective, your end customer, if you are the service provider, your end customer is more or less elevated of kind of any IR35 risk. So there's no need to look at status. There's no need to hold any sort of tax liability or anything like that. It simply doesn't exist because the client would have nothing to do with IR35. They're not engaging with a limited company contractor. It's a deliverable or a product or a project that they'd be receiving. And HMRC has confirmed in its guidance, again, that same reference we've quoted earlier, that where you are receiving a contracted out service and that is genuine, the client will not be the end user for IR35 purposes and therefore will not be required to carry out any IR35 status terminations. So this is quite an attractive offering for an end customer because it alleviates a potential tax risk that would exist for them should they place limited company contractors. But again, you've kind of got to be careful because some businesses are placing an over-reliance on this promise, and a large number of recruiters or contractors are repackaging their services just simply as contracted out. So more or less, you're taking one label off, putting a new label on it without really considering what actually has to change in the middle. And that's the key. It has to be a genuine statement of work. It can't just be a repackaged labour or kind of personal service of a contractor that you're still placing. You have to think about how that actual piece of work changes with what you're actually delivering. And I think the one piece of advice I'd give anyone who is either doing this or is thinking about doing it, ensure that your entire supply chain is absolutely rock solid certain about what the services are. So be absolutely rock solid on what you're receiving, what you're providing, and ensure that everyone's at least on the same page as to whether or not something's contracted out. And that will then impact what we'll cover off now. So on the assumption then that it's a genuine contracted out service and your end customer is therefore not affected by IR35 because they are not the end client for IR35 purposes, what that means is the service provider themselves, which is typically going to be now the recruitment business who's offering that, would become the end client for IR35 purposes. Well, what next? The simple answer is you would now go through everything as you would should IR35 be present, but you would do it from the service provider downwards. So there's no need to consider anything above that service provider, just from that service provider or contracted out service provider down. So the contracted out service business becomes the contractor's end client and therefore becomes responsible for the off payroll rules. And this means that you would then have to do all the same things that an end client normally would have to do. So check status, take reasonable care in doing so, issue SDSs, react to challenges of status, etc. The whole list of obligations then is present for the contracted out service business. Now, some service providers and service receivers will still, between the parties at the upper end of the chain, insist on the end customer issuing SDSs. We've seen that quite commonly. They'll say, well, hang on, if you're engaging limited company contractors, we just want to issue an SDS just in case. Our advice would be don't do it, don't cave to it, stick to the rules as they are. The end client's the one issuing the SDS, which would be the service provider. The service provider is now the end client of the contractor. All you're going to do by getting the end customer now, the service receiver, to issue SDS or even checking status at all that will do is raise some sort of suspicion from HMRC later on down the line because they'll question whether you understand what the supply chain looks like. And that's something that we've already seen across the industry with a few of the ongoing compliance checks that we sort of know of that are happening. Another thing to just consider is what happens if the service provider, so the recruitment business, is a small company. So quite often, particularly when they've set up a new entity that's kind of completely separate on its own, you will have a period of time where you will make use of the small company exemption rules. So IR35 will not apply to the service providing business, but instead we'll go back to the old rules where the contractor would be the one looking at status and carrying the actual tax risk. Again, quite an attractive offering because it alleviates the IR35 risk from everybody in the chain and places it back on the contractor. But you've just got to be absolutely certain of kind of what you're actually creating, again, make sure that the contract and the actual service that you're providing is genuinely contracted out. So just as a bit of an example then, in terms of what that supply chain might look like, typical supply chain, you've got worker on the left, personal service company of the contractor, the service provider, who is the contracted out service business, and then the service receiver, who's the end customer. So typically, in a normal relationship, the IR35 burden would sit with number 4, which is the end customer. Well, that's irrelevant, or that party is irrelevant from an IR35 perspective now, and instead, the end client is position number 3, which is the service provider or the contracted out service business. They'd be the one who's going to be looking at status, and they'd be the one issuing an SDS down to the personal service company and the worker. So again, it's quite an attractive offering for end customers because it alleviates them of risk. So what are the risks then? Just very quickly run through some of these. As a basic kind of risk, the implementation has got to be absolutely spot on. You can't just repackage the supply of labour. It has to be a distinct offering, a product, a project, or a thing, a tangible thing on its own that's there to kind of be either a kind of business model that can make a profit, or a business model that's going to be at least not just, you know, margin on a day rate of a contractor's head, basically. Now, whilst it alleviates an IR35 risk from the end customer, it doesn't remove IR35 entirely. It just simply transfers the responsibility of it to somebody else. So implementing a genuine contracted out service is a good thing for your end customers. If you do it right, obviously, as we say, it alleviates the risk from them, but it doesn't remove IR35 entirely. It just shifts who's going to be actually looking at it. And that will either be the contracted out service business, which might be your business, or it'll be the contractor, depending on your kind of company size. And as I say, the other risk here is that HMRC are definitely aware that contracted out services are being abused. So, you know, make sure that you're getting this absolutely spot on if you choose to take this route and offer a contracted out service. Just do all the sort of you know, key bits of kind of DD up front. Have your processes reviewed, have your contracts reviewed if you feel the need to, but just make sure that the formation of this is correct, because HMRC, as I say, are very aware of it, and you sort of don't want to be the guinea pig that gets tested, because that will certainly come in the future. Now I'm going to hand over to Stu and let him cover off the last couple of slides.
Thanks, Rye. Just kind of further due diligence and considerations as a business, if you are currently engaging in a statement of work, fully contracted out service, or you are looking to pivot into that kind of business model, it's just one to be wary of what your group insurance currently covers you for. As referenced in kind of a few of the bullet points there, sometimes it can be referenced as an employment agency on your traditional, obviously, group insurances schedule, and just making sure that if you are moving into this kind of business model, that you're referencing that on your business insurance. We've definitely seen an increase from the service providers, that if they are engaging with a service receiver, that they have got the adequate insurances in place. Clearly, that increases the risk profile of your business, but ultimately the exposure to the end client. So if you are or currently looking to engage with a fully contracted out service, make sure your group insurance is applicable, and if not, seek the relevant advice to see what that could look like, and the cost implications with it as well. And just lastly, Ryan's obviously referenced kind of like our solution as a whole, and it ties in nicely with IR35 in general. Quite clearly from our software and how we assess status, that is critical from an IR35 perspective, but to the kind of wider piece around support, advice, and risk mitigation for your business. We obviously have people like Ryan and Andy Vesey within our firm to support with fully contracted out service, best practice, and how this can look for your business and future engagements. And clearly from a risk profile, we're able to provide insurance to make sure you're adequately covered. So if that is something which you would like to inquire or know a bit more about, feel free to engage with Keith. Our contact details are provided, and we can discuss any of the kind of 3 service provisions, which we're more than happy to assist with.
think that's all from Stu and I. Happy to field any questions if you've got any.
Any questions, guys? Becky, you're off mute. Is that a question? No. Cool. All right, look, we're on time, guys. So yeah, thanks, Stu and Ryan, for that. Recording will be sent around to everyone that's attended and to the whole group, and we'll provide you with contact details for you to book a call directly with KingsBridge as well. So if you have any follow-up questions or you want to watch the webinar again or share internally, then you can do. So that'll be with you in the next 24 hours. But great to see you both. Thanks, Ryan and Stu. I'll see you again soon.
Cheers, Keith. Thank you all.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Yes,
Take
thank
care.
you.
Cheers.
Do you need me to do anything on the host side, Keith?
Can you just make me host again? Reclaim host. There you go. I'm host.
Go if I stop share there.